from a structural deficit that was large to a structural deficit that was really large. So, and we made up a little bit of that now, but again, it's a long-term kind of problem. And I think the answer is we have to, as David said, find out ways to deal with this, part on the spending side, part on the tax side. Now, the other thing which we take some comfort in, but it's probably not comfort for the state of Illinois, is the non-impairment clause. The non-impairment clause says that pension benefits can't be diminished. There's questions about that, whether it's only prospective or so on, but generally there's that kind of protection. Now, we all have taken some comfort in that, and I think rightly so, and I think that in a sense, as David said, there's kind of a moral as well as an economic issue here, that you could argue that these are agreed upon kind of things, and the state has to honor its contributions, honor its promises. But on the other hand, it creates a kind of straitjacket for the state. We have fewer degrees of freedom than we might otherwise. Most other states don't have that constitutional protection. So I'm a member for a few years of service in Ohio back in the 70s. And it's similar to Illinois. It's outside the Social Security system. They have a state pension system, but there's no guarantee. So every once in a while, I'll get a letter in the mail saying your cost of living adjustment has been suspended for 2 years, or we're going to do this or that or the other thing, or they're going to increase contribution rates. So we don't really have that kind of flexibility. Now, that's good in the sense that it protects our benefits, but it also makes it much more difficult for the state to respond. Now let me turn our attention, we're getting closer and closer to the question I'm sure you're all asking, what about pensions in the future? A couple of years ago, the state passed a fairly comprehensive and fairly punitive kinds of changes in the pension system, and that was going to save some money for the state, not as much as they suggested, but at least save some money. But from my standpoint, it was clearly unconstitutional from the very beginning. The idea of giving people a choice between two bad things is not necessarily not violating the non-impairment clause. But anyway, the argument that the state made is kind of an odd bill, because most bills just say we want to do this. This bill started with a several point argument about how dire the Illinois fiscal situation was, and because of all these problems we face, therefore we could abrogate the constitutional requirement for the non-impairment clause and do all these impairments. Well, it was not a very convincing kind of argument, but the main reason was that, as I said earlier, pensions are not the cause of all the state's problems, they're also not the solution. So we have all these problems the state faces. There's no particular reason you want to try to load it all on the pensions. Pensions probably should bear some of the burden, but not all. So, for example, the people who were pushing this bill, I'm not sure how the term came about. They call it the police powers of the state. In order to maintain the ordinary activities of the state, we're in such dire situation that we have to go back on the non-impairment idea. But at the same time we're doing this, one, we allowed the tax to expire, so it's hard to argue that you're in an exigency kind of situation. You simply can't pay your bills, and oh, by the way, we're cutting taxes by 2%, 2 percentage points. There are also other options. They could, again, we wouldn't like that probably, but they could start taxing retirement income. They could start taxing services, a whole host of things that could be done, and they simply didn't do that. So I don't really think that you can argue right now that we're in such an extreme case that we have to abrogate the kind of promises. The other thing is that some people talk about state bankruptcy. Well, there's right now in the United States, there's no option for state bankruptcy. There are options at the city level, municipal level, but not at the state. But the same idea seems to come up here. But if only we could have some kind of national rules to allow states to declare bankruptcy. And then again, the idea is we would declare bankruptcy. That would mean we didn't have to honor the constitutional protections and so on, and that could solve some of our problems. But it's still the same kind of issue. Bankruptcy doesn't mean in a business or an individual or a local government, it doesn't mean you get to keep the good things and you aggregate or give up on the obligations you have that you don't like. If you go into bankruptcy, you're putting yourself at the mercy of the courts or whoever the organization is. Everything has to be on the table. So I would argue if it really is at some point in the future that dire a situation, we should be looking at a lot of things, pensions included, but also bondholders. Why should pensioners have to take a haircut and not bondholders take a haircut? A whole bunch of things go in there. So it's not as simple as saying, we'll declare bankruptcy or some functional equivalent of that, wipe off a lot of our pension obligations and then go forward and we'll be all right. It's simply not, it's not fair, but it's also not likely to happen. It's kind of an interesting story. San Diego, I think San Diego County had a major pension underfunding problem. They thought, well, maybe we could, declare bankruptcy, restructure our debts and so on, everything would be fine. And someone pointed out to San Diego that Torrey Pines, the golf course there, is part of the city owned. So if you're going to go bankrupt, you're going to throw in Torrey Pines golf course. It's one of the most expensive pieces of property in the world, probably. So again, if you're going to do it, you have to do it all the way. You can't pick and choose what you want to deal with. Now, back to even more narrow things. Where are we now in terms of our situations? I assume most of you are retired or close to retirement, and it appears that the state of Illinois has given up, at least temporarily, on trying to cut pension benefits for people in retirement or near retirement based on that recent court case. The consequence is that we're focusing on changing in other ways, which makes the pensions for incoming people very meager. So it's kind of an odd situation. The people that are already here, we're taking care of them, but the people we'd like to attract here, the people we'd like to come to teach and work and so on in our schools or colleges and so on, are being offered a very meager kind of retirement benefit. So that's another issue we have to address in the future. So again, one last thing, actually, it's very rare that we have good news. Steve and I attended a meeting yesterday, and actually the funding ratio for SERS went up from about 41% to 44 plus, which is a kind of a good result. If you started out and said you're 44% funded, that's not good news, but if you're 41% funded, 44% looks pretty good. Okay, thank you.
If anybody has a card with questions on it, please let me know so I can pick them up.
Great. Well, thank you to both of our speakers. That was both illuminating and depressing, even though it's always good to end on an upbeat note. I want to give up most of my time to answer your questions, so Bill will hand me your cards in just a second, but maybe just to get the ball rolling, I'll ask a question that's been sort of puzzling me for a while, and maybe there's an obvious answer. But Fred, what made it so easy back in the 1980s, and then sort of continuing to do so, what made it so easy for the General Assembly and the governor to, for employers to put off making these obligated payments or to borrow against them? It seemed that other states had firewalls or regulations in place that seemed to prevent it. Was it just about political will or budgetary pressure?
Someone said that it goes all the way back to the beginning of the system back in 1940 or so. So it was always done, and it's got bigger and bigger, but there's also an age factor. Back in those days, the employees were growing, number of employees were growing, very few people were retiring, so the immediate consequences weren't very dire. It was the long-term kind of things, and politicians are known for their foresight or looking at the long term. So again, if you're you're a legislator or a governor in the 1980s, you say, okay, we're underfunded now. Someone said, well, look, in 2015, that's going to be a big problem for the state. Well, you're not going to be there as a politician. You're going to be long gone. And if your option is, should I push these into the future or raise taxes today or lower spending today, they usually took the expedient option.
If I can just chime in, I don't remember this, but I have heard that one of the things that made it easy to do that was the constitutional provision that said they were going to pay the benefits. So, the unions perhaps, or the public workers maybe didn't shout loud enough because they thought, well, we're protected, right? So.
Yeah, it's interesting to sort of reinforce that. The state of New York, by and large, doesn't have major pension problems. And the reason was that the unions there didn't trust the government. So what they did was to the extent they could, insist upon funding the pensions. So New York has, what I said earlier, more of a bond problem. They have to figure out a way to pay off their bonds while their pensions are close to fully funded. So this lack of trust actually worked to the benefit of the people in New York.
So my next question is a combination of some of them that I've seen in the index cards, but I guess to both of you, what do you think is both the most sort of painless and politically probable way of bringing up the funded liability percentage? Is it, I guess, what do you think the options are, but which, just if you had to sort of gamble on what might actually happen in the next 10 years,
Well,
what's a possibility?
I guess my answer, which I'm sorry is a little bit convoluted, there are two kinds of pension systems. One is a pre-funded system where you pay while people are working and you draw on that when they retire. The other is a pay-as-you-go system like Social Security, which you basically just take money from people who are working and give it to people who are retired. Well, the state of Illinois pensions are supposed to be pre-funded, but de facto they're basically a combination of a pre-funded and a pay-as-you-go system. So again, it's not a very elegant solution, but I think it's going to be a muddled through kind of solution, which will kind of move along and pay enough in to keep the pensions funded enough so they don't go into insolvency, they can make their payments easily, but never really get back to full funding. So I would think it's going to be maybe never, but certainly a long time we actually solve the problem, but I think we'll be able to deal with it in an elegant sort of way over a period of a couple decades.
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess, if you want, what's the painless solution? Well, there really isn't one, but the least painful solution is, let's have, economic growth on the scale of, California's Silicon Valley or something, right? That would be wonderful, right? And that would certainly help. Or the stock market keeps going up and never crashes again. That would help too. But I think, I agree with Fred. It's going to be, we just have to be in for the long haul. And it's just going to be patience. And I think, my understanding of it is that there's not necessarily a crisis because you can sort of operate on a hybrid sort of partly pay-as-you-go system for quite a while.
Actually, it's kind of a dirty little secret, but in the last 2 or 3 years when the state didn't have a budget and colleges weren't getting paid and community colleges weren't paid and all of that, CSRS got its payments year after year on a timely basis. So the state actually was making payments during that period of time. And as David said, they've already ratcheted it up to this new level. The new level is high, but it's not going to grow in an outlandish sort of way. So if we could basically sort of keep things going, that would be great. The problem is that everyone can't be first in line. We would like to be first in line saying all state money should go first to the pensions and then every place else. There was a constitutional amendment approved last year that said all transportation funds have to go to transportation. Now there's a move afoot to say that K through 12 education has to be funded automatically regardless of how much revenue you have. So if you take away all these different categories, it leaves almost no flexibility in the rest of the government.
What do you think in terms of additional revenue generation? There are two options that have been floated. One is taxing services at the sales tax rate, and another is actually applying the income tax to pension income, which is we're one of the few states that doesn't do that. Would that make much of a difference?
I'm going to go back to the other question, and then I'll get to that if I could. The long-term problem in pensions is solved. The reason it's solved is because we put in a really meager Tier 2 system, right? And those guys are actually paying, they're basically, the state doesn't have to contribute hardly anything to pay their pensions. So, 35 years down the road, there is no pension problem. There is a problem with what are you going to do about Illinois workers, what are you going to do about all those people who retire and don't have a pension, but there is no pension problem long term, right? Now, I don't think it's a very good solution, but that problem is solved. It's just a question of getting there. And I think the U.S. writ large, so this pension problem of people not having enough to savings, you know, that's a very, very broad problem in the economy, and the U.S. is going to have to deal with it as those of us in the baby boom. Some of us are lucky, but those of us in the baby boom age, we're going to have to make some transition and figure out how we deal with long-term income security. Sorry for that segue,
But I mean, you mentioned, and I think this is a good point, that in many ways our pension problem is a fiscal policy problem more generally, a sort of a structural fiscal
Right.
problem, and there have always been ideas floated in terms of, particularly on the revenue side, few people want to touch the service cuts or on the expenditure side, but we just got another one too, raising the corporate income tax. How, even if these are incremental increases in the tax rate, you mentioned that the real problem is the growth over time in expenditures relative to those taxes. But of these three, which one do you think might be a sort of politically palatable option for the next couple of years?
I can say, contrary to what many of us believe and what I believed until a while back, pension income was not always excluded from the income tax. When the income tax was approved back around in the 1970s, it basically worked on the federal tax, and in those days and now, there's sort of two ways to tax income. One is to tax it when you earn it. The other is to tax it when you draw it out and use it. And so the rule would be tax it one place or the other. Don't tax it both places, but at least one way. Well, in Illinois, we don't tax it when it goes in. We don't tax it when it comes out. But that was approved a year or two after the income tax was approved by some legislator who was a financial planner and said, well, why would we do this? And then there's no big deal in those days. There weren't many 401k kind of accounts. The age distribution was quite different than now, so there was no big consequence in terms of revenue, but over the years, it's become a very big one. Now, the thing that many of us, many people don't understand is, if the state is going to tax retirement income, they can't just say we're going to tax public employees' retirement income. They have to tax everyone's retirement income, and that's a huge political hurdle to overcome. I'm sorry, the corporate tax is I'll sound like I'm not defending the corporate tax. Most economists think it's not a very good tax. It's particularly not very good the way we employ it. And right now, if you combine the federal corporate tax with the state tax, it's very high compared to the rest of the world. So the chance of getting a whole lot more revenue there is not very great. And one of the problems with taxation is what you like to tax isn't necessarily something you can tax because of the idea of mobility. So people and firms and activity can change. So if you have a really high tax rate on certain kinds of activities, they're more likely to leave. And nowadays, economic activity is much more mobile than it was in the past. You don't have lots of factories and things of that sort. So you can move your computer from New York to New Jersey and process your trades, and it's no big deal nowadays. So it's not as easy to extract money out of those kind of entities as it might have been in the past.
Yeah, so, I think it's almost a no-brainer to tax retirement income. It seems like it would be more equitable, it would be more efficient. Economists love it. It's not administratively a big hassle. Other states do it.
And then you could have a floor like the first 40,000.
Yeah, you could exempt some income. It hasn't happened. It doesn't seem to generate, I don't know why it's so politically difficult to do, but it's very, very politically difficult to do. Extending the sales tax to services, there are estimates that that's going to generate lots and lots of revenue. I have a hard time getting my mind around that because the services, there'll be a lot of services like medical care and insurance that, we're going to end up exempting. And there are a lot of administrative hassles to expanding the sales tax to services. So I think that one, although it's something I think the state should look into, could broaden the tax. There's a little bit of interest in doing that in the most recent legislative session. I'm pessimistic it's going to make a big difference in terms of revenue. Corporate income tax, I largely side with Fred. I don't think, it doesn't generate a lot of revenue now. It's probably not going to generate a lot of revenue in the future. You know, there's all sorts of reasons why, you know, we want to be a business-friendly state. There's all kinds of reasons why that's not likely to be a very easy way to go. You know, I think we really have to look at the income tax, and you know, perhaps we could have a graduated income tax rate, but that's years down the road if we're going to do that. But the income growth has been among high-income people, and so you know, there's more potential to get revenue from that group, I think.
Well, you couldn't accomplish exactly that. I mean, you could certainly raise the rate and then have a very big increase in the exemption level or something of that sort. You get a small amount of progressivity in the system that way.
What do you think the probability of a constitutional amendment is that would retrospectively or affect current pensioners?
Again, it's a political question, not easy to guess. Constitutional amendments in Illinois are not easy. They can't be brought by initiative except in very limited cases about changing the legislative article. So a bunch of people can't get together and sign a petition and then put that on the ballot. So the only way it goes on the ballot is if both houses approve it and put it on the ballot. Then it has to be approved in the next general election by a 60% majority, or at least 50% of those voting, not just on the issue, but voting in general. So typically, constitutional amendments don't get passed very often. So the first thing would be, how would it be put there? What would it be? Would it be just, we're getting rid of the non-impairment clause? Would it be more specific? All kinds of issues that way. There's still a second question, whether a new constitutional amendment means that old contracts are no longer in force. And there are two lines of defense about pensions. The first is the constitutional defense, the other is kind of a contract defense, saying that there is a kind of implicit contract between the workers and the employers, and you can change it in different ways, but you can't change it retroactively. So it would be a really long process. So the first process would be getting on the ballot, which is pretty substantial, how many state legislators want to vote to put that on the ballot. The second thing was getting it passed. And the final thing was, how would you actually implement it in a real-life situation? So again, for us, or for me, we're talking about 5 years or 10 years, something of that sort. Obviously, in the long run, that makes a difference, but it's not going to solve our problems immediately.
And I guess the only thing I would add is that, you know, the pressure to do a constitutional amendment or even to act in an extra constitutional way, I guess living in Illinois over the past few years has made me doubt the force of the Constitution, quite frankly, in a very, very sad way. That, it's a political environment, and the political pressures are stronger when there's more tension on the legislators. And we've reduced a little bit the fiscal tension, but I just worry that if we don't bring more structural balance to the budget, that bad things could happen. So, what I'm saying is, this group needs to have a broad approach to think about the fiscal health of the state if you want to protect, the much more narrow cause that you're oriented around, in my view.
Also, I don't think David and I made the point squarely, because we sort of know it, but a lot of people said we had this 2+ year impasse at the state level and nothing got done, and all of a sudden we had this grand bargain that took place and we got together again. Well, that grand bargain basically took us back to where we were before, which was a very bad situation. So we're back to kicking the can down the road. So people were happy about getting back to a situation that was pretty bad to begin with.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, yeah.
Just in terms of extracting potentially more revenue or cost savings, we have some questions about whether or not what would happen at the federal level if there was something like single-payer health care or Medicare for all. Would that then reduce, because the state is still contributing a sizable share of the Medicaid budget, and then similarly a question about why the tollways don't seem to be making money, why their cost is going up by 4.6%, and I didn't check that against your numbers, but any thoughts about that? And then I think we've about 7 minutes, am I right, Bill, to open it up for the audience beyond just your cards. If we can also start circulating the microphone. Dave, if you want to respond.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's very hard to speculate on what the federal solution, what federal policy might be about health care. I think, anything that can be done to reduce healthcare costs is going to be beneficial to the fiscal situation in the country and the economic situation in the country, and that's just a huge thing. There's really, between the Democrats and Republicans, very different philosophies about how you reduce it. I mean, the Republicans want more competition, and the Democrats basically want more regulation. And I think, it's trite to say it, but there are good ideas on both sides, and we have to figure out a way to get the best ideas and improve sort of healthcare delivery in the country. That's fine.
Just a clarification. If you're a retiree, you get a lot of healthcare information from SERS, but SERS is only a conduit there. All the healthcare issues are at the state level, and since we have access to people through the retirement system, SERS actually sends that out and maybe provides some advice, but there's no funding. None of our funding is designed to help pay for healthcare or anything of that, so that's a totally separate issue. It's an important issue, but it's separate from SERS.
And I'm sorry, I can't comment on the tollway. I don't know the specifics.
I think the tollway is a classic example of the way government works. If you have extra money, you can't take it home. They don't steal it, but they build a tollway out to the Iowa border or whatever. There's always something to do if you have extra revenue. So I think it's unlikely we're going to. That's going to generate a lot of money back for the state.
There seems to be some consensus that the diagnosis of sort of how we ended up in this situation relates to the state's sort of intentional underfunding of the pensions, but we have a question about just the kind of secular changes that may have contributed to that. For example, increasing longevity, spousal longevity, shortfall of investment income. What's happened with the sort of the cyclical aspects of the business cycle, as well as these other more sort of secular demographic trends.
Well, I think the general answer is those are not as important as you might think, because those are things that have happened gradually, and our actuaries are supposed to take those into account. So we're not assuming that people have life expectancies the way they did in 1970 or something of that sort. That's incorporated in. Now, predicting the future obviously is more difficult, but there is some incorporation of those kind of things. The other thing about investment returns, they haven't always been fantastic, but over a long period of time, our expectations have actually been met. There's still challenges in the future around whether we continue that, but again, I would take it back to the underfunding. All the other things have some importance, but they pale by comparison.
We have probably time for a couple of questions from the floor. Sydney?
Yeah, I was wondering if the changes in Tier 2 and new employees, which seem to the plan, which seem to me to be pushing people toward self-managed pensions, whether that has an effect on the overall funding levels of SERS for Tier 1 people.
Yeah, it does in a sense. This is a case where our workers may have benefited by the lack of knowledge on the part of the state. When they revised the pension system back in 2009, they changed a whole bunch of things, but they didn't change the SERS self-managed plan. So the SURE self-managed plan, especially for highly compensated employees, is much more attractive than the Tier 2. There's a shorter vesting period. There's no cap in terms of the contribution level. A whole bunch of things are advantageous. So anyone coming now who is a relatively highly compensated employee would be wise to do that. Now, the problem with that is that you never underfund a defined contribution program. You just put the money in when it's earned, but you can't redistribute that. So that's all going to the people who are in that plan, and none of it kind of goes over to the under